Our story unfolds in Sydney, Australia on the 2nd of February, 1986, centering on a 26-year-old woman named Anita Cobby. Born in Sydney on November 2nd, 1956, she was the daughter of Gary and Grace Lynch. Anita maintained a very strong bond with her family, who always saw her as a person of immense inner and outer beauty. In her youth, she took part in beauty pageants, and in November of 1979, she was crowned Miss Western Suburbs. Everyone in her life believed she had the makings of a professional model. Anita's mother worked as a nurse, and while growing up, Anita hadn't initially planned to enter the same profession. However, as she matured, she found herself increasingly drawn to the field and the chance it offered to care for others and make a meaningful impact. After finishing her studies, Anita began her nursing career, starting a program at Sydney Hospital. Her colleagues would later comment that she was a natural caregiver, possessing a gentle demeanor that instantly calmed her patients. It was during her training that her life intersected with that of a fellow student, a man by the name of John Cobby. John later admitted that the moment he first saw Anita, he was completely captivated by her. But he felt she was so far beyond his reach that he never worked up the nerve to ask her for a date. He was certain any attempt would be futile. As it turned out, he didn't need to, because during one of their shifts, Anita struck up a conversation with him, and the two started talking. Soon after, they made plans for a dinner date at a local restaurant, and from that night on, the pair was virtually inseparable, developing an incredibly strong connection. Within the first few months, they had already moved in together. They were a couple for quite a while before John proposed, and not long after, Anita discovered she was pregnant. Both were overjoyed by the idea of starting their own family. They shared the news with their loved ones, and the future looked bright for them. Tragically, Anita later suffered a miscarriage. Despite this heartbreak, their bond remained strong, and in 1982, they were married in an intimate ceremony surrounded by their closest friends and relatives. They chose to forego a traditional honeymoon, opting instead to put their savings toward renting a home. They adopted 2 dogs and even bought a small boat. Following their wedding, the couple relocated to Coffs Harbour. It was there that John discovered a passion for training racehorses. His new venture quickly proved successful. For him, he wagered on a horse he had personally trained, and his bet paid off handsomely. His winnings totaled over $10,000, which, adjusted for today's inflation, would be approximately $51,500. With their newfound wealth, they decided to take the trip of a lifetime, embarking on a journey around the world together. After extensive travel, John felt he had seen and done enough and was ready to put down roots and begin raising a family. But by then, Anita had begun to question whether that was what she still wanted. Her perspective had shifted during their travels, which is a fairly common experience. Anita and John realized their life goals were no longer aligned, and in 1986, they mutually decided to separate. While the split was painful for both of them, they were convinced it was the necessary course of action, at least for the moment. During this period of separation, Anita poured her energy into her nursing career while second seas, residing with her parents in Blacktown. Even though they were apart, Anita and John stayed on friendly terms, and the affection they had for one another remained. John would later characterize their separation as more of a temporary break than a permanent end to their relationship. And by January of 1986, they had started discussing the prospect of reconciliation, though they were committed to take things one step at a time. The pair had even started searching for a new house to share, ready to restart their life together. On the 2nd of February, 1986, Anita was on duty in Sydney. That day, she wrapped up her shift at Sydney Hospital at 3 p.m. and then went to meet some friends for a meal in Redfern. Afterward, Anita took a train from Central Railway Station heading to Blacktown Station. Normally, she would have phoned her father for a ride home, but that particular night, the public phone was out of order, and there were no cabs in sight. At least 2 individuals later reported seeing Anita after she departed the station. Under the cover of darkness, Anita was walking home along Newtown Road in Blacktown when a car carrying 5 men suddenly screeched to a halt beside her. It was a stolen vehicle. In a terrifying instant, two of the occupants leaped out, violently forcing her into the car as she screamed desperately for help. This brutal abduction did not go unseen. A courageous teenage boy, who was with his mother and younger sister, heard the commotion and ran outside. The boy's immediate instinct was to help, but the attackers fled in their vehicle before he could get close. He went back inside and immediately notified the authorities of the horrifying event he had just witnessed. The teenager gave a peculiar detail about the men inside the car. He noted that the men in the back seat appeared to be sitting unusually high, so much so that their heads were nearly touching the ceiling of the car. This was because they were sitting on top of Anita, using their weight to pin her down and conceal her during what was undoubtedly the most harrowing car ride imaginable. The men then commanded Anita to remove all of her clothing. She denied their demand, pleading with the men to release her and telling her captors she was married and menstruating, hoping this information might be enough to elicit some compassion and save her. But these men were devoid of any humanity. Instead, their response was to savagely attack Anita. The assault was so ferocious that her nose and both of her cheekbones were completely crushed. The agony and terror she must have felt are beyond imagination. After destroying the bones in her face, the men then forced her to perform oral acts on all 5 of them. From there, they drove to a 24-hour gas station. They seized Anita's purse, used her own money to fill up their fuel tank, all while she was held down naked in the back of the car. Her captors continued their brutal assault as they drove her toward an isolated field in Falm. The assault on Anita was so savage she was left incapacitated. Her attackers then dragged her through a barbed wire fence and into a field. There, the brutal assault carried on for what seemed like an eternity. For hours, they continued to beat and violate her. A farmer living nearby, who was close to the isolated field, heard piercing screams. He dismissed the sounds, assuming it was an animal in distress, or perhaps some teenagers just fooling around. He was completely unaware of the horrific reality unfolding nearby. After hours of this torture, it dawned on the men that, if they let her live, she would be a witness. The ringleader of the group made a final chilling decision. Anita had to die. Egged on by the others, he produced a knife and advanced on her. Anita knew exactly what he intended to do, as he pressed the cold steel against her throat. In a final act of defiance, she grabbed the sharp edge of the blade, holding on for dear life as a short. The struggle broke out. The result was catastrophic. Several of her fingers were nearly sliced off as the attacker sawed through her hand. After cutting through her fingers, he turned the blade on her throat, sawing with such merciless force that she was almost decapitated. In a final depraved act, they draped her lifeless body over the barbed wire fence before all 5 of the men fled the scene. They took her clothing with them and incinerated everything, hoping to erase all traces of what they had done. When Anita didn't come home that evening, her parents assumed she was simply staying the night with a friend. It wasn't until she failed to show up for her job the next morning that they officially reported her missing. Then, on February 3rd, the following day, a farmer stumbled upon her body in that same field. Authorities immediately connected the discovery to Anita, since her parents had just filed the missing persons report. The victim was still wearing a wedding band. A detective was dispatched to Anita's parents' residence to ask if they could identify it. They recognized the ring instantly. The devastating news was then delivered to her husband, John. The information about his wife's murder completely shattered him. He couldn't bring himself to believe that Anita was gone, and he was consumed by overwhelming grief. Only 3 days after learning what happened, he turned to illicit drugs as a way to cope with the pain. Investigators launched an immediate search for her killer, or killers. As is common in cases like this, the first person they looked at was someone close to the victim, a friend, a relative, or, most commonly, the spouse. It was no secret that John and Anita's relationship had been going through a rough patch. To many people looking in, John seemed like the most logical suspect. The focus of the investigation quickly shifted to him, and even those who knew him personally began to suspect he was responsible. For the investigators, it felt like the case was practically closed. All they needed was concrete proof that John was the one behind it. They brought him in for questioning, but their interrogation methods were, according to John's account, both coercive and physically aggressive. Detectives started by telling John that he was guilty, insisting they had proof and that his best option was to confess. He later alleged that they physically assaulted him, slamming him into a wall and shoving him to the floor. John was already consumed by a terrible guilt, feeling that he should have been the one to pick Anita up from the restaurant that night. If he had, he believed, none of it would have transpired. This was an exceptionally unfair burden for him to carry, as he held zero responsibility for the actions of those men. But between the crushing guilt he was experiencing, his drug-addled mind, the marathon questioning sessions, the physical intimidation, and the constant pressure from the officers to admit his guilt, John finally confessed to a crime he didn't commit. He reached a point where he started to question his own sanity and wondered if he could have blacked out and committed the act, given how certain the police seemed. But the facts of the case just didn't support his confession. As investigators dug deeper into the horrifying details, inconsistencies began to surface, forcing them to reconsider John as their suspect. The sequence of events leading to the murder didn't align with his confession, and he was eventually cleared. The entire ordeal sent John spiraling into a profound depression. Meanwhile, with the true killers still at large, the sheer savagery of the crime led police to fear that those responsible would strike again if they weren't captured soon. Anita's funeral was held not long after, and the service was heavily documented by the media. Relatives would later remember John's utter collapse at the service, screaming and begging for them not to take his wife away. In what was widely seen as a controversial move, a local radio host read graphic details directly from Anita's autopsy report on the air. This broadcast ignited a firestorm of public outrage and put immense pressure on law enforcement to find her killers. The medical examiner's report was profoundly disturbing. Anita's body bore evidence of a beating so severe that it left even the most hardened officers and forensic experts in shock. Her attackers had subjected her to an appalling level of torture. She had lacerations across her body, consistent with being dragged through a barbed wire fence while she was conscious, multiple slash wounds to her neck, and her ear was nearly cut off. She suffered from widespread and severe bruising across her face, head, shoulders, legs, groin, back, and thighs. The assailants appeared to have concentrated their brutality on her chest and groin, as these areas sustained catastrophic damage. Her trachea was slashed, and 3 of her fingers had been almost completely amputated. These were identified as defensive wounds from Anita's struggle against her attackers. In fact, the coroner noted numerous such wounds along her arms and wrists, indicating that Anita had fought fiercely for her life. Her entire body was battered and covered in blood. Her orbital bones were fractured, and both eyes were blackened from the trauma. Both of her cheekbones were shattered and her shoulders were dislocated. There was also speculation that a knife was used to torture Anita's genital area, though this was later officially refuted by the coroner. The fair government issued a substantial $50,000 reward for any information that would lead to the arrest of her killer or killers. It was evident to the autopsy team that Anita would have endured an incredibly agonizing death. Her killing is still considered one of the most savage in Australia's history, and for many, it remains the most infamous. The name Anita Cobby is recognized nationwide. After details from the autopsy were released on the radio, the public was consumed with fury and cried out for justice. There were demands for the responsible parties to be hanged. Detectives began to piece together Anita's last known activities, hoping a public reenactment might prompt a witness to step. A pivotal break in the case occurred when a police informant gave authorities a tip about a stolen vehicle. This information would ultimately lead them to John Travis and Michael Murdoch. Travis admitted to stealing the car, but gave contradictory accounts regarding the murder and was taken into police custody. Investigators were certain he was involved, but they could not secure a confession from him. John Travers then asked to phone a friend, and the number he provided was given to the investigating officers who made the call. The woman on the line was revealed to be John Travers' aunt, who was given the pseudonym Mrs. X. Mrs. X consented to cooperate with the investigation, providing police with details about John's background. Despite their family connection, Mrs. X was horrified and repulsed by what had been done to Anita Cobby. She expressed her belief that if John was guilty, he should face the most severe consequences allowed by the law. In a shrewd undercover maneuver, Mrs. X agreed to record a meeting with both John Travis and Michael Murdoch. During the conversation, both men confessed to their roles in the crime. This confession implicated 3 implices: Michael, Gary, and Les Murphy. All 5 individuals were subsequently charged with the murder of Anita Cobby. It took only 22 days from the Murphy date of the murder for all 5 men to be charged, for which the police force was praised for their swift and decisive work. Michael Murphy and his brother Gary were the last to be apprehended, having gone on the run. They were eventually tracked down, and upon his arrest, Gary was reportedly so overcome with fear that he urinated on himself. A scuffle broke out as Gary vigorously fought against being taken into custody. This resistance resulted in his face being scraped along the ground, causing deep abrasions to his skin. Gary later alleged the police had inflicted the injury on purpose. As news of the arrest spread, hundreds of people gathered at the police station. The crowd was seething with rage. Some officers expressed genuine concern that the mob might try to pull the suspects out into the street to enact their own form of justice. Now that the killers were captured, one unsettling question lingered in the public mind. Who could possibly commit such an exit act of unimaginable cruelty? The suspected ringleader of the group was John Travis, merely 18 years of age at the time. John possessed a significant criminal history. He was the eldest of 8 children and grew up in poverty in Blacktown. By age 14, he was already an alcoholic and had been expelled from school. When his father deserted the family in 1981, John resorted to petty crime to support his siblings, until his mother's declining health became so severe that he and his brothers and sisters were placed in foster care. Most alarming was John's history of violent tendencies, which seemed to foreshadow the brutality inflicted upon Anita Cobby. He exhibited violent behavior towards men, women, and frequently animals. It was alleged he would defile birds he had stolen before killing and cooking them. He was also accused of violating lambs and sheep before slaughtering and roasting their bodies. Michael Murdoch was John's childhood friend and partner in crime. He had spent a significant part of his youth in juvenile correctional facilities, where he was subjected to intense violence. The trial for the murder of Anita Cobby opened in Sydney on the 16th of March. In 1987, each time they were escorted into court, crowds would form, with many singling out Gary as he entered and shouting, "That's the coward who pissed his pants." The prosecution laid out an airtight case against the defendants, building it on forensics, witness accounts, and the confessions secured by police. The defense team for the men pushed back with several strategies, chief among them being to undermine the validity of the confessions and challenge the forensic findings. During the proceedings, Gary's lawyer also tried to elicit sympathy for his client by focusing on the beating he took during his arrest. One of the arresting officers was called to the witness stand, where Gary's attorney grilled him, wanting to know how Gary's face had gotten so scratched up. The officer flatly stated, "It must have happened when my boot was on his head." The defense continued to argue that the confessions had been forced and that the forensic results were inconclusive. The trial became a media sensation as the public watched intently, praying that justice would prevail. After a long and emotionally draining trial, the jury reached its decision. John Travers, Michael Murdoch, and the Murphy brothers were found guilty on all counts: abduction, sexual assault, and the murder of Anita Cobby. Every one of them was sentenced to life behind bars with no possibility of parole. Information also surfaced that in the weeks leading up to Anita Cobby's murder in February of 1986, John Travers had held a knife to the throat of a 17-year-old boy in Western Australia. He had sexually assaulted him. The attacks were strikingly similar, except the 17-year-old was allowed to live. Even with the maximum penalties imposed, a significant portion of the public felt the punishment was not severe enough. The people wanted them to endure what Anita had, or at a minimum, be executed for their crimes. Photos emerged of some of the murderers smiling after being charged, showing absolutely no remorse for their horrific act. That utter lack of contrition further enraged the public, intensifying the calls for capital punishment. After the devastating loss of their daughter, Anita Cobby's parents connected with the parents of another homicide victim. Together, they created the Homicide Victim Support Group, a community-focused organization to assist families affected by violent crime. In the wake of their daughter's murder, Anita's parents also became fierce advocates for harsher sentencing laws. Their campaign eventually sparked changes in the legal system. One of the 5 killers, Michael Murphy, passed away in Long Bay Hospital. He died on the 21st of February, 2019, at 66 years of age. The other murderers are still imprisoned. Some of them have reportedly been the target of regular beatings from other prisoners. John Cobby always expresses his satisfaction when he hears about these men being attacked. During an interview, John confessed, "I still have dreams about killing them. Revenge was the only thing on my mind. It was all-consuming. It was a poisonous thought that I lived with for so many years. I would still kill them in a heartbeat, without any hesitation. I'd happily spend the rest of my life in jail for it. In my dreams, I've ended their lives in countless different ways. The mark they've left on me will never go away." On one occasion, a prison beating left one of the killers so injured that he had to be transferred to a hospital. It was later discovered that Gary was being treated in the very same hospital where John Cobby was working as a nurse. John said that learning this made him feel physically ill. He told people close to him that Gary was lucky he had no idea he was in that building. Because if he had known, he stated, he would have killed him on the spot. As the years passed, John Cobby managed to conquer his addictions. He was able to rebuild his life and find a new partner. He even got remarried and had 2 children, though the couple later divorced. John also had his last name legally changed from Cobby to Francis in 1987 because he felt the Cobby name had become synonymous with Anita's murder. He also wrestled with feelings of responsibility for what happened to her. Years later, however, he made the choice to change his name back to Cobby. His children supported his decision and did the same, changing their own last names from Francis back to Cobby. Both of Anita's parents have since died. Anita's sister shared that her parents never truly overcame the loss of their daughter. It was a burden they carried every day for the rest of their lives. The woman known as Mrs. X, whose secret recording of her nephew's confession helped secure justice, is still under witness protection today. People with ties to the killers are not pleased with her actions, and those individuals want her dead for simply choosing to do the right thing. She continues to face credible threats against her life. The legal proceedings against Anita Cobby's killers became a landmark case in Australian jurisprudence. The guilty verdict provided a small degree of resolution for Anita's family and for the country. Even people who had never met Anita felt a deep personal connection to the case. A plaque was installed in the Sydney hospital to commemorate Anita's life. But now, a truly sickening development is underway. The New South Wales Bar Association has supported a motion that threatens to overturn the very definition of a life sentence. It would create a path for Anita Cobby's 4 living murderers to request leniency and a possible date for release. Perpetrators of even the most violent and dangerous crimes could eventually be eligible for parole after serving time in prison, along with undergoing counseling and rehabilitation. Anita's family fought tirelessly to ensure that her murderers would remain behind bars forever. In the public's view, the thought of these men ever being granted even a chance at freedom was considered a profound injustice. As mentioned before, this case is regarded as one of the most heinous crimes in the history of Australia. Consequently, any suggestion that these men might be granted parole is expected to trigger a significant public outcry from the Australian people. If any of these killers are ever considered for release, I will make it a point to keep all of you informed. We can only hope that the 4 killers who are still alive remain exactly where they belong, behind bars.